It is 1 o'clock, and so without further ado, I will start their presentation. Albanian Spash Prison. Here it goes.
Hi, I'm Rory Sullivan.
Hi, I'm Annika Latte.
And we worked on the Albanian Spash Prison project for our MQP.
Before we get into the project itself, we're going to talk about the history a little bit of this time and why this project was kind of established. So throughout the years of 1944 to 1985, dictator Enver Hoxha led the people of Albania through communist rule. And it was during this time that those who were a part of this time, they recount times of trauma and scarred memories, making it kind of difficult to reflect upon their experiences. And so in hopes of spreading awareness and knowledge about the Albanian history, organizations such as our sponsor, Cultural Heritage Without Borders in Albania, and the Albanian Ministry of Culture have declared it a priority to continue preservation efforts for historical and monumental sites, such as this prison itself. For many, the remains of this prison, the Spash prison, represent the damaged lines of memory transmission in Albania. And in hopes of repairing these lines of transmission and achieving these goals, our sponsor and I have developed a web-developed application containing a digital model to help users learn more about the prison itself. Serving as an interactive tour, the application would educate those of all ages about the experiences of Spash prisoners, allowing them to further understand the times of the communist regime.
So in the fall of 2019, WPI students began work on the Spash Prison digital reconstruction model. The project accomplished a significant amount of work by interviewing former prisoners, recording compelling stories, and completing user testing on the site. The site gave a rough, untextured mapping of the terrain around the prison, along with CAD models of the buildings. The student team used a bird's eye view of the prison with several points to click and zoom into. After the project was completed, our sponsor, Cultural Heritage Without Borders in Albania, continued to work on the digital reconstruction of the Albanian Spash prison. The organization began work to redesign the site's user interface. As a result, the site's aesthetic more closely matched that of other previously researched historical reconstruction sites. Some notable progress made by Cultural Heritage Without Borders on the virtual reconstruction includes the following. The terrain was redone and texture was redone to more closely match that of the real-life prison. Additional points were added to the model for users to explore, and labels were also added to said points. Although much progress was made on the virtual reconstruction of the Albanian Spash prison by both WPI students and consultants hired by Cultural Heritage Without Borders, plenty of work remained. With the aid of our sponsor, several tasks were identified and prioritized in relation to continuing the work of the virtual reconstruction. Some tasks included implementing labels for the CAD models and a language feature, which enables the users to switch between English and Albanian. Cultural Heritage Without Borders would additionally like the virtual reconstruction model to be less large in overall file size and less resource intensive so that it could run on older, less powerful computers, which are more prevalent in Albania. The load time for the model, even on more robust machines, takes around 3 seconds to load. This load time occurs every time the model of the page is brought up, which is something expected to happen frequently when exploring the prison. The original terrain file size was 68.5 megabytes and contained 999,999 polygons. The texture of this terrain was 8,192 by 8,192 pixels, which most textures do not exceed 2,048 by 2,048 in web-based real-time interactive media. In order to reduce the size of this texture, the application GIMP was used, which is a free and open source graphics editor used for image manipulation and image editing. The program was successfully able to reduce the texture size to 2,048 by 2,048 pixels, which is exactly 1/16 of the file size. While the program was able to reduce the texture size drastically with its UV map, which is the flat representation of the surface of the 3D model used to easily wrap textures, it was also able to maintain much detail to the point where hardly any noticeable difference can be seen. Despite overall reduction in size, the texture utilization in terms of the UV layout could be further optimized. The initial way in which the terrain was unwrapped, or the way in which the 3D geometry was flattened into a 2D space, was very inefficient. This was due to the fact that it used a form of UV tile mapping. In other words, rather than having one set of UVs for the entire terrain, the map was broken up into smaller fragments of UV space. This is considered an inefficient technique because the mesh essentially had UV seams running throughout its entire surface. As a result, the entire map was instead given a single proper UV space. This ensured that only the UV seam ran across the outer border of the geometry and not within the terrain. Finally, using a program called 3ds Max, a professional 3D computer graphics program, we were able to significantly reduce the number of polygons in the terrain itself. The terrain model was reduced from 999,999 polygons to 199,952 polygons, or 20% of the original count. In terms of application aesthetics, a major design flaw that was identified related to the overlapping of building labels. When certain angles and certain extents of magnification were applied to the model, some tags were pushed to the background, making it impossible to read the text essential to the design. Several solutions were discussed with our sponsor, such as a toggle for the tags, hover capabilities, and automatic position readjustments to avoid tags overlapping. The solution our sponsor favored the most was the approach of implementing hover capabilities to the tag. This approach involved initially removing the text from the labels and minimizing them to a small circle shape with a slight glow effect to prevent the labels from overlapping. Upon hovering over a building, the building would be highlighted green, and all labels attached to that building would then expand. Then, each label's text would be added back into the tag. All labels not attached to the hovered building would remain minimized, once again ensuring that no labels overlapped. A transition effect was additionally added to the maximizing and minimizing of labels. In order to set the scene and continue the site's color scheme, our team adopted and incorporated neutral tones rather than vibrant and distracting tones. Settling upon a gradient charcoal color for the background of the model, our prototype was able to convey a sense of mystery and seriousness. Furthermore, by creating less of a contrast between the terrain and the empty space in the environment, we'd be able to center the user's attention toward the terrain of the model. Additionally, a floor plane was added to the model and it was made a lighter grayish color. The terrain was also given an alpha map, which it originally did not have. This made the edges of the model fade into the background. When combined, both of these features replicate an effect similar to environmental fog. Furthermore, upon detailed inspection of the current Sposh prison's digital reconstruction, the need of camera movement restrictions became apparent. In the current model, the camera was not limited in movement, allowing for camera angles that appeared glitched and the models to appear as if they were colliding with one another. These issues could be attributed to the ability of the camera to move behind the terrain. Additionally, the map could be zoomed out on in such a large scale that the overall terrain in models would become nearly or completely invisible. In order to prevent this, we implemented a lock on the amount that the user is allowed to rotate or zoom out of.
Upon identifying key areas of improvements and encountering the design flaw enabling the overlapping and clustering of labels, it was also observed that certain labels did not have a target source. In order to prevent the user from mistakenly clicking on labels that possess no target source, the team decided to implement several subliminal stylistic choices in the CSS code in order to provide visual feedback. When the main goal of encouraging users to search for clickable elements rather than those without a target, several UI elements were altered. Firstly, when hovering over a building, the corresponding labels that were attached to the building maximized and turned yellow. Contrary to the buildings themselves, upon hovering over the newly showcased labels, those that do possess a target source and are able to navigate the user to a new subpage are now highlighted in a green color, while those without one remain yellow. Furthermore, if an unclickable label is clicked, the user is prompted with an error message. Visual continuity was another concern that was referenced when discussing the site's possible key areas of improvement, with various font choices and conflicting stylistic UI/UX elements seen throughout the website, such as different colored backgrounds, varying image sizes, and the inaccessibility of the sidebar menu of the model page. It was a priority to update the look and feel of the website. And in order to do so, our team applied Gestalt continuity principles in order to solve each of the issues discussed prior. A survey was created through Google Forms with questions which were divided into three main sections: user preference between 2D version views, ranking of the displayed versions based on animated GIFs, and open-ended questions intended to be answered upon physically navigating between the old and newer version. The survey results showed an improvement in each of the categories. As for our conclusions and recommendation, our main recommendation was to halt development on the website-based application and mainly switch gears to allow it to be more application-based. This is due to the technical complexity that arises later in development when trying to convert a web app to a mobile app. However, should the model be developed into an application, further production from that point would then be easier to roll out on all platforms. These may include mobile devices as well as various operating systems. As for acknowledgements, we would like to thank the following people and organizations for their help throughout this project: our professors and our advisors for their guidance, our sponsor for giving us the ability and the opportunity to work on this project, and the previous IQP students that helped to create a base for our project, and all those that aided in our survey as well. Thank you.
Okay, very nice. Questions?
Sorry, hi, this is Jennifer. For some reason, I became an idiot about how to unmute myself, but I did have questions. So I'm super interested in this because this is obviously an example of the interactive media side of the stuff that we do. And I'm wondering, like, one of the challenges is that you weren't in Albania. Like, how can you talk about, like, the fact that you weren't there and you're trying to do cultural heritage stuff, and what it allowed you to do to not be there, and what you wish you had access to?
Yeah, definitely. So originally it was supposed to be one where we had the option to go to Albania, but obviously due to COVID, that became no longer an option to us. But one of the main struggles of that was kind of scope, I'd say, because there was a lot of stuff where had we been there, we'd been able to do. So when we originally sat down and talked to our sponsor, there were certain things where he's like, oh, well, I'd like, for example, Worcester has a lot of Albanians in it, where we were talking about how we might be able to expand upon interviews so we could add more to the rooms. When you click on a certain like cell, for example, you could have more stories that go along there. But we were just never able to get to it because we didn't have the resources that we would have had we been in Albania. So that was definitely something. As well as just we were stuck with using what they already had. So built upon it. So for example, when you click on a room, there's a 360 image that you're allowed to kind of look around as if you're in the room or in the cell or courtyard or wherever it may be. And it was kind of tough because we just had those areas. We couldn't, as mentioned in the video, there were certain areas that didn't lead anywhere. So we weren't able to sort of make them lead anywhere because we didn't have access to create new 360 images. So we were kind of just limited to what was already implemented.
Well, thank you.
All right, then let's move along. It's almost 1:15. Who's up next here? Looks like, well, I can share my screen and show you who's up next. Character representation is up now with Davina.
Hello, and welcome to the Character Representation Project. Produced by me, Davina Dawson, and advised by Farley Sherry. Currently, it can be really hard to find many diverse character models online. We seek to change that. The Character Diversification Project focuses on 3D modeling stylized characters of color, while also paving the way for this project being continued in years to come. The main challenge here is producing these models in an authentic and respectful way. By nature of the project, I was faced with representing people from groups that I'm less informed about, so I had to research closely. Locating the line between authenticity and stereotyping isn't always easy. So for this project, I used a combination of research and discussions with first-hand sources to educate myself on the groups that I was representing. Another challenge that I identified early on was dealing with colorism. Colorism is a phenomenon that exists in ethnic groups where beauty standards are tied with having lighter skin, as well as other predominantly white features, such as hair texture. A lot of the references that I found early on felt like they were approaching diversity in a colorist manner. Because of this, I sometimes deviated from the reference. It also informed some of the reference topics that I picked, as I was focused on showing the natural beauty of these communities. The final challenge that I faced was my own 3D modeling ability. When I entered the project, I was inexperienced in making stylized character models, and I also had trouble depicting masculine body types. I faced this challenge by looking at a lot of resources and references, as well as by getting frequent critiques from my advisor. We followed a model where I worked on multiple characters at once so that I could step away from characters and come back with a fresh headspace. I found that the further that I got into the project, the more I had overcome this important obstacle. My first character, Daya, is inspired by the black actor India Moore. I chose India because of how they wear their natural hair with pride and beauty. India is also very dedicated to helping minority groups, so they seemed like a perfect first choice. India Moore is a non-binary actor who identifies with they, them, and she, her pronouns. After careful consideration, my advisor and I agreed that we would represent a feminine India. Our main reason was that I was already facing the challenges mentioned above, and adding the process of creating a gender-neutral character would complicate things too much. Further, people of color have many gender-related stereotypes that we wanted to avoid accidentally showing here. My second character, Jay, had an interesting progression to get where he is now. Originally, I had planned to model him from Kulik Rung from Soul Eater. This proved challenging as my modeling style does not lend well to anime styles. Anime styles also tend to minimize distinguishing facial features, which felt wrong for this project. Following that decision, we found a similar but more American-style reference. From there on, he was instead modeled after this piece. Kayla is based off of a Hispanic character art piece that I found online. While working on her, I came to realize that I had problems with her as a representative of the Latinx community. Specifically, she felt like a colorist representation. This felt personally wrong to me as a Hispanic woman. Under the whitewashing beauty standards imposed on the Hispanic community, I grew up straightening my hair and wearing light foundation in efforts to look as much like this beauty standard as I could. By now I've come to love my hair and skin tone, and I wanted the same for Kayla. For these reasons, I varied from the reference in order to make Kayla feel more representative of the actual community. I deviated from the reference by darkening her skin a few shades, as well as by giving her a different, more authentic hairstyle. Natsu is based off of two pieces representing Japanese characters. As shown, I used a face and hair reference and then a separate body and clothing reference. The references were carefully considered as it is common for Japanese male characters to be feminized in art. As various Asian communities are also prone to colorism, we chose his face reference because of his predominantly Asian features. Combining these two felt like the best way to represent him. From the start of this project, I knew that I wanted to depict a Muslim woman wearing a hijab. Middle Eastern Muslim characters are often either omitted or vastly misrepresented in media. When Muslim characters are depicted, they are often characterized as meek, shy, and old-fashioned. My advisor and I were determined to deviate from that characterization. For that reason, we had to be more creative with our character reference. For that reason, we chose the left reference for the body reference, as well as the right reference for the clothing and style reference. This came together to inspire Samira. Adonis came about through more intent to explore representation of men of color. Specifically, my advisor and I wanted to depict an athletic, attractive black male character. As black men are often feminized in media, we found it important to include a black male character that was distinctively masculine in his attractiveness. This reference stood out as an attractive, masculine black man, so that's why we picked him. Upon discussing the progression of the project, my advisor and I noticed that we had not included representation of any fat characters. We both agreed that adding a fat character would help express the diverse body positivity that this project is about. As large black women are often over-sexualized in media, we chose to commission her reference directly from another artist. The artist, Mackenzie Ensley, and I worked together to determine how the character should look, from body type to hair to clothing. Because of this, we were able to make a very individual character. My advisor and I both see this project as one with lots of potential for growth. We envision an online database of 3D modeled and rigged characters of color, where people can go to get characters representing underrepresented groups. For this reason, we think that the development of that database should be a recurring project at WPI, which we have affectionately named Rigs of Color. In future developments, we believe that rigs of color should be a more collaborative experience, where artists of different skill levels can come together to work on this amazing project. We tried out this functionality by working with a student in an independent study project, Kimberly Cadre. She developed one character for this project, Kim. She did an amazing job, from finding great character reference to representing it in a great way. After she modeled and painted the character, she handed it off to me so that I could touch it up and do some of the more technical elements of the process, such as topology and hard surface modeling of accessories. This sort of methodology could be used on future iterations of rigs of color so that all sorts of artists at WPI can come together to work on this great project. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Oh, very nice. Questions?
I actually have a question.
Okay.
So just about the basic concept of the project, whenever you first came up with the idea, were you thinking of presenting it as a recurring project, or was it just as you were working on the project, you were like, this would be cool if it was a recurring project?
Well, I guess the project isn't 100% from my brain, because it's something that Professor Farley, had been thinking about for a while. And I know that it was an MQP that was probably going to be done in the future, but given the changes that happened because of COVID this year, I just jumped into it here. So I think it was always supposed to be somewhat reoccurring or collaborative.
Okay, cool. Thank you. And great job, by the way.
Thanks.
I have a question, and I'd like to echo, really, really great job. I'm sorry if I didn't catch it, but how far along in the actual rigging process did you get, and what specifically are you making these rigs available for? Is this for any specific suite or multiple different versions? Like, how are we to imagine this?
So the rigging process is being done by sort of a sister MQP that Mr. Sherry is also advising, Patrick Slater on pipeline tools. The idea is that those two will come together, and their pipeline tools include an auto rigger that can be used to rig rigs of color rigs. We have not rigged any of them, but they're all modeled and retopoed and unwrapped and all that.
Nice.
Hi, this is Jennifer. I have a question as well. So awesome. I don't know if you've ever talked to Abdul St. Fleur, but she does work in this area as well. She's a graduate student in the program. I'm wondering, I like that you're looking at not just colorism, but different forms as a form of inclusive character design. Have you thought about different body types, not everyone being skinny?
I think what I was more interested in making characters of different body types, but we wanted to very much go along with the references that we found, which were very much thin and small. At that point, that's why Desiree became a character, to sort of go against that.
I see. Okay, cool. Thank you.
To just answer that question a little bit more, we commissioned art for her, and I think that would be a great way in the future to continue diversifying body types.
Yeah, also as sort of a future maybe add-on, I think maybe incorporating blend shapes or some form of morph targets to make these somewhat customizable and changeable to make them more versatile might be a neat feature. That way you have similar models, but with more versatility in the process.
Thank you.
Other questions? We got time for one or two more.
Hey, I guess I'll jump in. Great job, Davina. And I just wanted to ask, I wonder how the artist's own ethnicity determines the type of characters they develop. And if they do determine the types of characters they develop, do you think that this could be like a new version of a self-portrait?
some extent that did affect my own process through it. For example, when I was working on characters that were from a different ethnic background than me, I was trying to listen to those people a lot more on the topic and actually, make up for my lack of experience with research. But when I was working on Kayla, for example, who is from my background, I felt like I was able to use my own opinions more and actually judge what I felt like was right for the character. So I think that that would definitely be a large element of this project, but it's also very important, despite what your background is, to research heavily into any backgrounds that you're representing.
Anyone else? We still got time for a question or two.
I guess I do sort of have a question. How difficult did you find making the hairstyles off of your reference pictures?
Well, I started with Daya, which was definitely the most challenging one. So I had a bit of a hard time with that. But I think I made up for it with a lot of research. So upon really considering it ahead of time, it was not as hard as I thought it would be. It was also helpful with the stylized method to do this because, I wasn't going for a full head of curls that would all be different topology. I was stylizing it so that it could work better in a 3D space. So I didn't find it too difficult, but Daya was a bit hard.
Anyone else? I'm waiting for Josh to turn his camera back on. He looks like Allen Ginsberg at the film war in '68.
I guess if there's time, Davina, as a leading question, I guess how many iterations did you go through? Like when you talk about the research, I think there's the research where you are asking people about themselves so that you can be respectful, but what about the research and the pipeline and undertaking for just developing things visually?
Yes, that is a good leading question. I broke the pipeline down into some essential steps that I talked about in the paper that start with observing other works, followed with blocking, then form work, and then I shoved in critique process, but that's really all the way throughout, and then developing clothing and hair, and then shoes and other accessories, and then color, and then doing the technical stuff, including retopo, unwrap, and export. So that's the pipeline. It took a lot of research, and there were a lot of things that I didn't really fully know how to do when I came into the project. So it was nice to learn all that.
Okay. Well, thank you. Very nice. It is 1:30, and therefore time for the next presentation, which is Allison, relaunching COVID-19 Chronicles.
Hi everyone, my name is Allison Steves, and today I will be presenting my MQP, relaunching the COVID-19 Chronicles, a social media campaign during the COVID-19 pandemic for the professional writing and IMGD departments. So to start, what are the COVID-19 Chronicles? This is a digital community archive that wants to document how Worcester experiences the pandemic. It was started by Digital Worcester, which is the partnership between WPI and the Worcester Historical Museum, and it had two main goals. The first was to create an archive for historians in the future, and the second is to build a community in the present. This archive relies on user-submitted items that we call stories, which can be photos, videos, audio recordings, straight-up text, basically anything that you can upload to the internet. And so this project was launched in early last April at the start of the pandemic, and it saw a lot of participation initially, but as the pandemic continued on into the summer, it saw a big decline in user submissions. And so when I came onto this project, I wanted to see how I could revive interest in the initiative and use social media, principles of interactive media, to both inspire users to contribute for building that archive for future historians, and also to foster a space for dialogue around the pandemic in Worcester to build community in the present. And so I want to start by presenting my 3 main findings. The first of which is that to really meaningfully engage with audiences, especially during a pandemic that is characterized by lots of restrictions on in-person meetings and engagements, cultural institutions must adapt to digital spaces using cross-platform social media campaigns and dedicated community managers in order to appeal to what their audiences really care about. My second main finding is that the fast-paced, kind of trendy, spur-of-the-moment nature of most social media platforms really isn't conducive to the privacy and rights considerations that must accompany archival submissions. And this kind of suggests that social media may not be an effective or even an ethical tool for actually lowering barriers of entry to item submission. And my final main finding is that coordinating and integrating social media activities with exhibit construction for a digital community requires a lot of careful planning and an active contributor base. So a big part of this project for me was actually maintaining the social media presence. And I first want to give you a little bit of context on what the Historical Museum's current practices in social media were. They're active on Facebook and Instagram, and both of those platforms look exactly the same. They cross-post content between them, so they look duplicated, right? They post 18 times per week, 3 times per weekday, 3 on the weekends. And a lot of these posts are part of their Fascinating Worcester trivia campaign, which really kind of just tests institutional knowledge. So on one day it might be, here's this picture of this old building in Worcester. What building is it? And then the next day it'll say like, okay, here's the answer. Did you get it right? That sort of thing. And so I had a lot of different ideas for what I wanted to do with the COVID-19 Chronicles. I did want to have this discussion happen on Facebook with an eye towards kind of the long-term sustainability of the COVID-19 Chronicles social media presence, because that's just what the Historical Museum is most familiar with. But at the same time, I wanted to have a separate channel for the COVID-19 Chronicles, so this discussion around COVID wouldn't be watered down with all these other kind of like trivia posts. And so I still wanted to use the Historical Museum as a point of entry, but for this reason, I created my own Facebook page for the COVID-19 Chronicles, and I would post 4 times per week, 3 times on the COVID-19 Chronicles page, and once on the Historical Museum's Facebook page that kind of directed to the COVID-19 Chronicles page to act as that, that point of entry. And then in constructing my posts, I wanted them to be scaffolded in such a way that would include personal contribution calls, so people felt like they could draw on their own experience rather than it's just them knowing a quiz question or not. And then also use these posts to champion contributors of the archive. So here's an example of what this looks like. This was kind of the approach that I took to creating posts for the COVID-19 Chronicles Facebook page. And the first thing I want to point out is this idea of instructional scaffolding. This is something that Nina Simon, a professional museum experience designer, really emphasizes in her book, The Participatory Museum. And so the idea is that instead of using this open-ended language of, share your story, which is what a lot of the archive language has been previously, I instead wanted to create a really specific call, like how does media make you feel during the pandemic? And so it's deliberately designed so that anyone can kind of draw on their own personal experience and contribute to the conversation. Kind of this idea that, creativity thrives under constraints. And so the second thing here is that you can see that I am championing a current contributor by featuring an item from the archive. So the idea here is that this person who submitted this might be inspired to submit again, but I'm also inspiring others on what they can submit by showing them, hey, here's something that someone else submitted. You can submit something similar, right? And then finally, each post I kind of tried to tie together with a certain theme or topic to get the sense of like automatic storytelling, which is something that the British Museum actually bases a lot of their social media activity around. So this particular post was part of a like Art of COVID kind of campaign. And so I would feature these in sets of 3s to create that sort of automatic sense of story. And so in terms of how successful this page was for generating interest for the COVID-19 Chronicles, I won't sugarcoat it. We kind of saw an upward trends in post reach and the number of likes overall, but the numbers kind of still remained very modest across the board. No post ever received more than 5 likes. Comments were pretty much non-existent. And by the end of this past March, the page only had 35 followers. And so we did kind of see like an increase in the number of likes and the number of people that saw a given post when a post was shared one or more times, which is what you'd kind of expect if a post was shared. But overall, these numbers still kind of indicate a lack of penetration across the board, suggesting that the COVID-19 Chronicles Facebook page really did not succeed in building a substantial audience. And in terms of how social media was able to influence the contributions to the archive, I saw some correlation between my social media activities and the topics of item submissions. So for example, I made a post about Halloween during COVID, and we then got a submission about nurses dressing up on Halloween to like raise patient morale and cheer people up. But this is probably just the result of kind of opportunistic timing of it's around Halloween, we post about it, someone would submit about it too. So I can't really support those kinds of correlations there. Okay, but to support all of the data that I gathered from my own social media activities, I also contacted and I virtually interviewed 3 social media managers from other historical institutions across the country, with a focus on kind of how they and their institution navigated social media and community engagement during the pandemic. And I just kind of want to go through some of the main themes that I saw in these interviews. The first is this idea of algorithms. So this interviewee said, if we have a bunch of low-performing Facebook posts in a row, we're likely to stay in that tier of low-performing Facebook posts, and it's hard to climb out of that hole. So again, that's kind of explaining what happened with me. We didn't have a lot of penetration early on. The Facebook algorithm punished us for it, and it was very hard to climb back out. Another interviewee kind of spoke to the tensions between museums and users on social media. She said that some of the things that I feel are super compelling and interesting aren't necessarily the things that get the most likes, which is disappointing, but you got to remember that social media is such a clicky, short-term thing that people aren't necessarily digging as deep into it as you want them to. And as a history person, that can be really frustrating, right? So this idea of how can museums connect with users on social media when they have kind of different goals, and how can we align those goals by drawing on what users are passionate about. And then finally, I saw this interesting dynamic between the pre and post-COVID attitude towards social media. So speaking to that pre-COVID attitude, someone said that a lot of people are going to tell you like, well, my teenage son has an Instagram account. He could do your job. There's this idea that everybody's on it, so it's not that hard. And then in terms of a post-COVID attitude, I saw internally, my job used to be considered more of a bonus job, but now that the pandemic happened, social was the only way that we could connect with people. So it kind of became a free-for-all for all the different departments as to who could get me to post about them. So we really kind of saw this shift as the pandemic drove people to online spaces. The respect that social media managers got kind of increased. And so I want to conclude with 4 main takeaways for professional writing and interactive media. And again, the first is this idea of the pandemic has reinforced the importance of these online spaces. Social media can no longer really be an afterthought, but kind of do these institutions have the resources that they need to give social media the attention that it deserves? And if they don't, how can they get those resources? Participatory design principles like instructional scaffolding can be a good starting point for museums to connect with their audiences, but we also have to continue to learn and iterate on how we connect with these people. And, especially when we have these algorithms that are punishing social media managers who kind of try to experiment with their posts, how can we iterate without jeopardizing our current positioning? I would also think that future research might consider how social media can be integrated with institutional practices to build engagement. It would be really cool to co-build exhibits with our users, but these are really complex processes that are hard to simplify for the spur-of-the-moment nature of social media. So I think further research could look into what institutional practices we can actually use social media in novel ways for. And finally, I want to end on this idea of community, right? So if you consider the nature of community, it's really based around self-identities, whether that's, work, hobbies, race, gender, where you're from, the kinds of people that you associate with. And the closest thing that the COVID-19 Chronicles had to a defined community is the people that live in Worcester. But what does that mean for the people who don't physically live in, or the people who physically live in Worcester, but don't consider like being a Worcesterite as part of their identity? And so future social media professionals, like in this position that I was, might help museums think through who their community really is and how they can create content that connects with those identities of that community. So thank you for listening. I know I presented a lot of different ideas here, and I am happy to take any questions during the live Q&A session. So I'll see you then. Thanks.
Yeah, so I first of all, really lucid presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. I'm sort of speaking to the shift that you observed in COVID times, sort of the changes in the role in social media for these institutions. Do you see those changes as persisting when we get back to so-called normal, or are these transformations that will endure in some way?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's kind of the big question that everyone had sort of coming out of COVID, you know, and it's not just social media too. It's just like remote work in general, right? Like what is going to stay in the future? Are we going to keep kind of this hybrid model going forward as we consider, like, is it more efficient, that sort of thing? My interviewees all definitely sort of thought that the importance of social media might dip down a little bit as we kind of return to normal, but that ultimately it's still going to be an important thing going forward as well. So really thinking this idea that COVID kind of has accelerated this drive to digital spaces, and that kind of made it more important immediately rather than gradually. So yeah, no, I think it's definitely going to become a more important thing in this kind of post-COVID future that we're all entering.
Thanks.
Thank you. I see Dean with a hand.
I have a question. So I know that Facebook, especially for organizations, wants you to pay to promote any particular thing, any particular post. So from what I've talked to game developers who, you know, do a post and promote it, and they've actually spent money on it, and they said it is totally not worth it. That they got no engagement, no more engagement from a promoted one than a not promoted one. So I'm wondering what your thinking is of how to get out of the algorithm hole. Do you throw money at it? Has that changed? Because the algorithm's always changing, the promotion's always changing. Facebook is evil. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I get you. No, I mean, that's why this really needs to be thought of as kind of a professional field, because you really got to keep up with all these different changes in the algorithms and that sort of thing. And I know I didn't want to pursue any kind of paid advertisement or anything because, one, I didn't really want to include it in the budget for this project, but I also just kind of wanted to see how much organic social has to offer. And one of my interviewees said, like, you know, organic social media can really only get you so far, and you really do need to kind of chalk up the big bucks to actually get some engagement. But in the case of what I went through, I think really more planning early on and not limiting myself so much of just having the historical museum as that point of entry, but looking to what other points of entries can we have? Can we bring in people who aren't familiar with the museum to come be a part of this? Maybe not starting with just Facebook initially. Maybe we start with kind of a cross-platform campaign that's active on all these different platforms, Twitter, Instagram, you know, maybe even Snapchat or TikTok, which people are starting to experiment more with. So I think kind of bringing that all together and trying to address those issues early on could have helped my particular project. But in general, it's hard to know like how professionals can really combat these issues and get their brands out there. And that's why they need to think through these things. And I don't have all the answers for sure, but those are some of the ideas I have from this project.
It seems like you engage in banter with other brands and suddenly everybody likes you.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you think you would have done better if you had created some sort of conspiracy theory? Like, I know it sounds like a joke, but like the stuff like even around like the COVID vaccines, I have friends on the left and right who are just like, are you getting it or you took it? That's crazy. I'd never do that. Did you hear? So I'm wondering, do you think if you were able to throw a conspiracy onto what you were doing or lock onto one of them, would that have made it more of a difference and like would have been better than paying Facebook?
I mean, so a couple things there, because this is interesting, and I certainly wanted to be ethical in this, right? I didn't want to just get people angry because I don't know, that just didn't feel right to me. But one thing that's really interesting is that one of the only comments that I got was after I accidentally posted a picture of people not wearing masks, which was actually from a year before the pandemic, but that hadn't been made clear in the post. And so I got this person commenting like super angry, like she said, like, you know, what is this like dumbass cognitive dissonance? Like, you're the COVID Chronicles and you're showing people not wearing masks, right? What's going on here? And that was actually a really good opportunity for starting dialogue, because I kind of asked her like, okay, so you're kind of mask shaming here. What are you hoping to achieve with this comment? Do you think you can convince these people to wear masks? This picture was from a year ago, but I'm curious to just kind of explore these thoughts a little bit more. And she responded with this crazy like 500-word comment saying like, you know, I'm really sorry for how rude I was. I'm just super fed up with everything that's been going on with this pandemic. You know, I work as a nurse and I tried to go to such extreme lengths to protect people, and yet, you know, there are still these stupid people out there who aren't wearing masks. And so it was really interesting to see kind of how that miscommunication of kind of like a conspiracy, and not conspiracy theory, but that kind of conflict around masks sort of promoted this instance of intense self-reflection in this one particular person. So I think there's a lot of merit there to it's not always just, you know, asking the nice questions of like what gives you hope during the pandemic, but actually challenge people to think through these issues that we've all sort of faced here. So yeah, no, great question.